When the townsfolk of Cedar Ridge saw Marcus Kane marry the deaf girl everyone pitied, their laughter echoed through the Texas dust, convinced they were witnessing the biggest mistake of 1867. But within 2 years, Catherine Kane would transform from the town's object of mockery into its greatest source of pride, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come wrapped in silence. What they discovered about her talents would change not just their small frontier community, but challenge everything they thought they knew about what it means to truly communicate. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt, kicking up a cloud of red dust that made Marcus Kane squint his eyes. Cedar Ridge, Texas stretched out before him like a half-finished painting, wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry, and a church steeple that reached only halfway to heaven. The year was 1867, and the whole town smelled like horse sweat and big dreams. Marcus stepped down from the coach, his leather toolbox heavy in his calloused hands. After 3 years of war, he'd learned that a man could rebuild anything if he had the right tools and enough backbone. The July heat hit him like a slap, but he didn't mind. Heat meant work, and work meant money, and money meant he could finally stop running from the ghosts that followed him home from Virginia. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," called out a man with a belly that strained against his vest buttons. "Name's Jake Morrison. I run the general store and pretty much everything else that needs running around here." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the soft palm of a man who counted money more than he swung hammers. "Marcus Kane, I hear you folks need a carpenter." "Need one," Jake laughed, mopping his sweating forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "Son, we need about 10 carpenters, 2 doctors, and a miracle worker. This town's growing faster than weeds after a rainstorm." As Jake led him down the dusty Main Street, Marcus took in the sights. The barbershop sign hung crooked on rusty chains. The saloon's batwing doors had lost half their slats. Even the jail looked like it might fall down if someone sneezed too hard. But Marcus saw possibility in every broken board and loose nail. "That there's the Widow Patterson's boarding house." Jake pointed to a 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left. "She'll put you up for a fair price, and her cooking won't kill you." "Probably." They passed a group of children playing marbles in the dirt, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of hammering from somewhere near the edge of town. A woman in a faded blue dress swept dust from her front porch, pausing to wave at Jake before disappearing back inside. "Peaceful place," Marcus observed, already planning which buildings he'd fix first. "Mostly," Jake agreed. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "Though I should warn you about the Miller place. Old Henry's got himself a daughter, and well, she's not quite right in the head." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd learned during the war that every town had its secrets, and most of them were smaller than people made them out to be. "Pretty as a picture, mind you," Jake continued, clearly enjoying having fresh ears for his gossip. "Hair like autumn leaves and eyes green as spring grass. But she can't hear nothing. Not a word. Been that way since she was born." They stopped in front of a half-built schoolhouse, its wooden frame reaching toward the sky like the skeleton of some great beast. Marcus set down his toolbox and ran his hands along the rough lumber, feeling for weak spots and checking the joints. "Shame about the Miller girl," Jake went on, not noticing that Marcus had stopped listening. 22 years old and still living with her daddy. What man's gonna want damaged goods like that? Can't even hear her own wedding vows. Marcus felt something hot and angry twist in his chest. He'd known men during the war who'd lost arms, legs, eyes, good men who'd come home to find their own families treating them like broken toys. The casual cruelty in Jake's voice reminded him of everything he'd hoped to leave behind. "This schoolhouse," Marcus said, changing the subject. "When do you need it finished?" "Before the snow flies, if possible. Kid's been learning in the church, but Preacher Williams says they're too noisy during his Sunday preparations." Marcus nodded, already seeing the finished building in his mind's eye. Straight walls, solid floors, windows that would let in plenty of light for reading. Children deserved better than broken-down buildings and half-hearted efforts. "I'll need to see your lumber supply," he said, shouldering his toolbox again. "And I'll want to talk to whoever's been working on this frame. Some of these joints look solid, but others—" He shook his head. As they walked toward the lumber yard, Marcus caught sight of a small house on the edge of town. It was neater than most, with a flower garden that showed someone cared about beauty even in this rough place. Hanging laundry danced in the hot breeze, and he could see a woman's figure moving behind the windows. "That's the Miller place," Jake said, noticing his gaze. "Like I said, you'd best stay away. Henry's protective of his girl, and she don't take well to strangers anyway. Probably scared of her own shadow." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. Something about that tidy house and careful garden spoke to him of quiet strength rather than weakness. He'd spent 3 years surrounded by the sounds of war, cannon fire, screaming, the wet thud of bullets finding their mark. The idea of a world where silence meant peace instead of death seemed almost magical. That evening, as Marcus settled into his narrow bed at the boarding house, he found himself thinking about green eyes and autumn hair. Outside his window, Cedar Ridge slowly quieted for the night, but sleep wouldn't come. Something about this place felt different from all the other towns he'd drifted through since the war ended. Maybe it was the way the sunset painted the buildings gold, or the sound of children's laughter echoing off the wooden walls. Maybe it was the promise of honest work and a chance to build something that would last. Or maybe it was the memory of a small house where someone had planted flowers in ground that most people saw as nothing but dirt and possibility. Whatever it was, Marcus Kane had the strangest feeling that his running days were finally over. The morning sun caught the dew on Catherine Miller's roses, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. She knelt in her garden, her hands gentle as she checked each plant for signs of disease or damage. The work calmed her mind the way it always did, giving her thoughts a place to settle while her body stayed busy. At 22, Catherine had learned to read the world through her eyes and hands instead of her ears. She could tell when rain was coming by the way cats arched their backs, when someone was angry by the set of their shoulders, when winter would be harsh by how thick the squirrels' coats grew. People thought being deaf made her less aware, but it had actually made her more so. She was reaching for her watering can when movement in the street caught her attention. A man she'd never seen before was walking toward the center of town, his stride confident and purposeful. He wore simple clothes, brown pants, a blue shirt, and boots that had seen plenty of hard use. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made her pause in her work. Unlike most strangers who passed through Cedar Ridge, this man didn't seem to be looking for the saloon or the gambling hall. Instead, his eyes took in the buildings like he was measuring them, studying them the way Catherine studied fabric before cutting a dress. When he stopped to examine the crooked sign on the barber shop, she saw him shake his head with what looked like professional disappointment. Catherine's father, Henry Miller, emerged from their small barn, his face already shiny with sweat despite the early hour. He followed her gaze to the stranger and frowned. "Probably another drifter looking for easy money," he said, his voice carrying the bitter tone that had become common since Catherine's mother died 2 years ago. He couldn't see Catherine's face, so he didn't know she was reading his lips. "This town's full of men who think they can get rich quick." But Catherine didn't think this man looked like a drifter. Drifters moved with the lazy confidence of people who didn't care about tomorrow. This stranger moved like someone who built things to last. She watched as Jake Morrison appeared and began talking to the newcomer, his hands gesturing wildly as they always did when he had fresh gossip to share. Catherine had learned to read Jake's lips years ago. He was one of the few people in town who spoke clearly enough for her to understand without much effort. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," she saw Jake say, and she felt the familiar mixture of curiosity and dread that came with new arrivals. Some people treated her with kindness, others with pity, and still others with the kind of nervous fear that came from not understanding something different. As Jake led the stranger down the main street, Catherine found herself following their progress from behind her garden fence. They stopped at the unfinished schoolhouse, and she watched the newcomer set down a heavy wooden box and run his hands along the building's frame. The way he touched the wood, careful, knowing, respectful, reminded her of how she felt fabric between her fingers when she was planning a new dress. Carpenter, she realized. That explained the toolbox and the way he studied every building he passed. Jake was talking again, his mouth moving in the exaggerated way that meant he was sharing something he considered important. Catherine couldn't make out all the words from this distance, but she caught enough to know they were talking about her. Jake's expression, the way he glanced toward her house, the slight shake of his head, it all added up to the same conversation she'd been the subject of for years. The poor Miller girl. What a shame. Damaged goods. Catherine's cheeks burned with familiar embarrassment, but she didn't look away. She was used to being talked about, used to seeing pity in people's eyes when they first learned about her deafness. What surprised her was the stranger's reaction. Instead of the usual mixture of curiosity and discomfort, the carpenter's face grew dark with something that looked like anger. Not anger at her, but anger at Jake. His jaw tightened, and he seemed to deliberately turn his back on her house, as if refusing to participate in whatever gossip Jake was sharing. Catherine felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had defended her, even silently? When was the last time someone had looked annoyed by the way people talked about her instead of looking annoyed by her existence? The two men moved on toward the lumber yard, but Catherine remained in her garden, her hands still and her mind racing. She'd grown up watching people's reactions to her deafness like other children watched storm clouds, learning to predict when kindness might turn to impatience, when curiosity might turn to cruelty. But this stranger had surprised her. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, he'd chosen not to listen to the gossip about her. Maybe that didn't mean anything. Maybe he was just being polite. But maybe, just maybe, it meant something more. That afternoon, Catherine walked to the mercantile to buy thread for the dress she was making for Mrs. Patterson. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, and she felt the familiar shift in conversation that happened when she appeared in public spaces. Voices grew quieter, more careful, as if her presence required some special kind of behavior. She was examining spools of blue thread when she sensed someone watching her. Turning, she found herself looking directly into warm brown eyes that belonged to the carpenter she'd seen that morning. He was standing near the counter, a list in his hand, but his attention was focused entirely on her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Catherine felt her heartbeat quicken, not from fear but from something else entirely. The carpenter's gaze wasn't pitying or uncomfortable. It was simply interested, like he was seeing her as a person rather than as a problem to be solved or avoided. Then he did something that made Catherine's world tilt on its axis. He smiled, not the careful, too bright smile that people usually gave her, but a real smile that reached his eyes and made tiny lines appear at their corners. Without thinking, Catherine smiled back. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Then Jake Morrison's voice boomed across the store, shattering the spell. "Marcus, you find everything you need." The carpenter Marcus turned away to answer, but not before Catherine saw him glance back at her one more time. She clutched her spool of thread to her chest and hurried toward the door, her face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and something dangerously close to hope. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Catherine allowed herself one quick look back through the mercantile window. Marcus was talking to Jake, but his eyes were on her. And unless she was very much mistaken, he was still smiling. For the first time in years, Catherine Miller began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone might see her as more than just the deaf girl who lived at the edge of town. Marcus Kane's hammer struck the nail with a force that made the entire schoolhouse frame shudder. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Catherine Miller at the mercantile, and he couldn't stop thinking about those green eyes that had looked at him without fear or pity. Every swing of his hammer seemed to echo the same question. What was he going to do about the deaf girl who'd made his heart skip like a stone across water? "You're gonna split that board if you keep hitting it like you're mad at it," called out Tommy Jenkins, the 15-year-old boy who'd been assigned to help Marcus with the construction. Tommy was all elbows and enthusiasm, eager to learn carpentry from someone who actually knew what he was doing. Marcus paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The August heat was brutal, but that wasn't why his shirt was soaked through. Working helped him think, and right now his thoughts were tangled up tighter than fishing line. "Sorry, Tommy. Mind was somewhere else." Marcus examined the nail he'd driven too deep into the wood. It would hold, but it wasn't his best work. Somewhere else or someone else? Tommy grinned, showing teeth that were still too big for his face. Saw you staring at the Miller place this morning when you thought nobody was looking. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. Just studying the carpentry work on their fence. Good joints, solid construction. Aha! Tommy's grin got wider. And I suppose you were studying carpentry when you spent 10 minutes talking to Mrs. Patterson about what kind of thread Catherine Miller likes to use for her sewing. The boy was too smart for his own good. Marcus had indeed pumped the boarding house owner for information about Catherine. Learning that she made most of her own clothes and helped other women in town with their sewing when they needed delicate work done. Mrs. Patterson had spoken of Catherine with genuine fondness, which told Marcus more about the girl's character than all of Jake Morrison's gossip combined. "Hand me that level," Marcus said, changing the subject. But as Tommy passed him the tool, a commotion from the street caught their attention. Dr. Samuel Hayes was hurrying toward the Miller house, his black medical bag clutched in his white-knuckled grip. Behind him followed Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women, their faces tight with worry. Something was wrong. Marcus dropped his hammer and started toward the street, Tommy close behind him. They weren't the only ones who'd noticed the doctor's urgent visit. Several other townspeople had emerged from their shops and houses, craning their necks to see what was happening. "Henry Miller took a bad fall," explained Sarah Chun, the Chinese woman who ran the laundry. Her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with precision. "His horse spooked at something, kicked him hard in the chest before running off." Marcus felt his stomach clench. Henry Miller was Catherine's only family, her protection against a world that didn't always treat different people kindly. If something happened to him, is he going to be all right? Tommy asked, his young face serious now. Sarah shrugged, but worry clouded her dark eyes. "Dr. Hayes will do what he can. But Henry's not a young man anymore." Through the open door of the Miller house, Marcus could see people moving around inside. Catherine appeared briefly in the doorway, her face pale and frightened as she spoke with Dr. Hayes. Even from a distance, Marcus could see her hands shaking as she tried to communicate what had happened. That's when he realized something that made his chest tight with anger and sadness. Catherine was alone in there with a crowd of people, trying to understand what was wrong with her father, and most of them probably couldn't talk to her in any way she could understand. They meant well, but their kindness was useless if they couldn't bridge the gap between her world and theirs. Marcus had learned some basic hand signals from a deaf soldier during the war. Nothing fancy, just enough to ask for water or warn about enemy movement. It wasn't much, but it might be better than nothing. "Tommy, finish checking those joints," he said, already walking toward the Miller house. "I'll be back." The crowd parted as Marcus approached, probably figuring he was just another curious neighbor. But instead of stopping at the edge of the group, he walked straight to the doorway where Catherine stood, her green eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Miss Miller," he said, then lifted his hands and began to move them in the simple patterns he remembered. His fingers felt clumsy and uncertain, but he managed to spell out, "I want to help." Catherine's eyes went wide with shock. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then her hands moved in response, fluid and graceful in a way that made his rough attempts look like a child's scribbling. "You know sign language?" she asked with her fingers. "A little," Marcus admitted, both speaking and signing at the same time. "Learned from a friend during the war. Not very good at it." But Catherine's face had transformed, relief washing over her features like sunrise after a long night. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't alone with her fear. "The doctor says Papa has broken ribs," she signed, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "He's having trouble breathing. I don't know what to do." Marcus felt something break open in his chest, not from sadness, but from a fierce protectiveness he'd never experienced before. This brave, beautiful woman who faced the world's indifference with such quiet strength shouldn't have to face her worst fears alone. "What do you need?" he asked, his hands moving more confidently now as muscle memory returned. "Someone to help me understand what the doctor is saying," Catherine replied. "Someone to help me take care of Papa." "Then that's what you'll have," Marcus promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As Dr. Hayes emerged from the house, looking tired and grim, Marcus stepped forward to serve as Catherine's voice and ears. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. A partnership born from crisis, built on communication that went deeper than words. The people of Cedar Ridge watched this exchange with growing amazement. They'd never seen anyone talk to Catherine Miller with their hands before. Never seen her face light up with understanding and relief. Marcus Kane, the quiet carpenter who'd only been in town for 3 days, was doing something none of them had thought to do. He was treating her like a whole person instead of a broken one. And as the afternoon wore on, with Marcus translating between Catherine and the doctor, helping her understand her father's condition and what his recovery would require, the townspeople began to see something they'd never noticed before. Catherine Miller wasn't the helpless, damaged girl they'd always assumed her to be. She was a woman of strength and intelligence who'd simply been waiting for someone to learn her language instead of expecting her to learn theirs. Marcus Kane was about to discover that in helping Catherine find her voice, he'd also found something he'd been searching for since the war ended. A reason to stop running and start building a life worth staying for. Catherine's hands trembled as she tried to thread the needle, but her mind kept wandering to the man who sat by her father's bedside, reading aloud from the local newspaper in a voice low enough not to disturb the patient's rest. Marcus Kane had been coming to their house every evening for 2 weeks now, ever since Papa's accident, and Catherine still couldn't quite believe he was real. The territorial governor announced plans for a new railroad line. Marcus read, his finger following the words across the page. Papa's eyes were closed, but Catherine could see his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that Dr. Hayes said meant he was healing properly. Marcus looked up and caught Catherine watching him. His smile was becoming as familiar as her morning cup of coffee, but it still made her heart flutter like a bird trying to escape a cage. "How's the mending coming along?" he asked, nodding toward the pile of clothes in her lap. Catherine held up the torn shirt she was working on, one of Papa's favorites that had gotten caught on a nail. "Almost finished. Mrs. Patterson brought me 3 more dresses to hem, and the banker's wife wants me to alter her Sunday dress before the harvest festival." What she didn't mention was how the extra sewing work had become a blessing in disguise. With Papa unable to work, they needed every penny she could earn. The accident had shown her just how much their small household depended on his daily wage from the lumber yard. Marcus set down the newspaper and moved his chair closer to where Catherine sat by the window. The late afternoon light made his brown hair look gold at the edges, and she had to force herself to focus on her needlework instead of the way his hands moved when he talked. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice careful in the way that meant he was about to say something important, "about what happens when your father gets back on his feet." Catherine's needle paused halfway through the fabric. This was the conversation she'd been dreading, the one where Marcus would explain that his good deed was finished and he'd be moving on to the next town, the next job, the next life that didn't include a deaf girl and her aging father. "I know you've been worried about money," Marcus continued, and Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Had her worry been so obvious? "But I think there might be a solution that could help both of us." Catherine set down her sewing and gave him her full attention. Marcus took a deep breath, like a man preparing to jump off a cliff. "I've been watching you work," he said, his hands moving along with his words in the simple sign language they'd been practicing together. "The way you sew, the care you put into every stitch. Mrs. Patterson told me you made her daughter's wedding dress last year, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone in 3 counties had ever seen." Catherine felt a flutter of pride mixed with confusion. Where was this leading? "The thing is," Marcus went on, "Cedar Ridge is growing fast. New families arriving every week, women who need someone skilled to make their clothes and fix their mending. But right now, they have to send away to San Antonio or Austin for anything fancy, and that takes weeks and costs more than most folks can afford." Understanding began to dawn in Catherine's mind, bright and terrifying as a lightning strike. "I think you could start your own business," Marcus said, his brown eyes intense with conviction. "A proper dress shop right here in town. I could build you the shop space, help you get started. We could be partners." Partners. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge Catherine wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. She'd never imagined herself as anything more than Henry Miller's daughter, the quiet girl who helped when asked but never expected to be the center of attention. "I don't know if I could," she began, her hands moving uncertainly. "You could," Marcus said firmly. "I've seen what you can do, Catherine. These women would be lucky to have you making their dresses." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of voices outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison talking animatedly with Lucinda Hartwell, the woman who currently ran the only dress shop in Cedar Ridge. Lucinda's pinched face was red with anger, and she kept pointing toward the Miller house. Catherine couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read the sharp movements of Lucinda's mouth well enough to catch the general meaning. Something about that deaf girl and getting ideas above her station, and decent people won't stand for it. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. "Looks like word's already getting around about our conversation." "How could they know?" Catherine asked, then felt foolish. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, secrets lasted about as long as ice cream in August. "Probably saw me asking Mrs. Patterson about empty buildings for rent," Marcus admitted. "I should have been more careful." Catherine felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the burden of being different in a place where different was often seen as dangerous. Lucinda Hartwell had been making adequate dresses for adequate women for 20 years. She wouldn't take kindly to competition, especially from someone she considered inferior. "Maybe this isn't a good idea," Catherine said, her hands moving slowly as doubt crept into her voice. "People talk, and they don't always say kind things about me. What if they won't buy dresses from someone who can't hear?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes fierce with an intensity that took Catherine's breath away. "What if they will? What if there are people in this town who care more about quality than gossip? What if you're exactly what Cedar Ridge needs, and you just don't know it yet?" Catherine stared at him, seeing her own reflection in his eyes. Not the broken girl that others saw, but someone capable and strong and worthy of dreams. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling. "Besides," Marcus added with a grin that made him look years younger, "I happen to know that the banker's wife is already bragging to her friends about the beautiful alterations you're doing to her dress. And Mrs. Chun mentioned that she'd love to have someone local who could make clothes that actually fit properly instead of hanging like flour sacks." Despite her fears, Catherine felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You've been asking a lot of questions around town. A man likes to know what he's getting into before he makes a business proposition," Marcus said solemnly, then ruined the effect by winking at her. Catherine laughed, a sound she made so rarely that it always surprised her when it happened. But Marcus seemed to have a gift for drawing laughter out of her, along with dreams she'd never dared to voice. From the bed, Papa stirred and opened his eyes. He looked from Catherine to Marcus, taking in their close proximity and the way they were smiling at each other, and Catherine saw understanding dawn in his weathered face. "What are you two plotting over there?" Papa asked, his voice still weak but tinged with curiosity. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances, and Catherine felt a strange new feeling building in her chest, hope mixed with determination, fear balanced by excitement. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people decide what she was capable of. Maybe it was time to find out what Catherine Miller could really do when someone believed in her. "We're planning to change everything, Papa," she said, her hands moving with growing confidence. "And I think we might actually be crazy enough to do it." The wildflowers in Marcus's hands shook like autumn leaves as he climbed the steps to the Miller front porch, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he wondered if the whole town could hear it. 3 months had passed since Henry Miller's accident, and in that time, something had grown between Marcus and Catherine that was stronger than friendship, but too fragile to name out loud. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad instead of asking a girl's father for permission to court her," Tommy Jenkins observed from his perch on the schoolhouse steps across the street. The boy had become Marcus's unofficial shadow, learning carpentry during the day and apparently studying romance in his spare time. Marcus shot him a look that could have melted iron. "Shouldn't you be helping your mother with chores?" "Already done. Besides, this is way more interesting than feeding chickens." Tommy grinned and settled in to watch the show. "The whole town's been waiting to see if you'd work up the courage." That wasn't helping Marcus's nerves any. He'd faced Confederate soldiers and survived 3 years of war, but the thought of sitting across from Henry Miller and explaining his intentions toward Catherine made his mouth go dry as desert sand. The door opened before he could knock, and Catherine appeared, her green eyes bright with surprise. She wore a dress of soft yellow that she'd made herself, and Marcus thought she looked like captured sunshine. "Marcus, I wasn't expecting you until this evening." Her hands moved gracefully as she spoke, a habit she'd developed since he'd started learning her language. "I know, but Marcus held out the wildflowers, his usual confidence deserting him completely. "I wanted to talk to your father. About something important." Catherine's eyes widened, and a flush of pink colored her cheeks. She understood immediately what kind of conversation required wildflowers and formal visits during daylight hours. "Papa's in the kitchen, drinking coffee and complaining about Dr. Hayes's orders to rest," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Fair warning, he's been expecting this conversation for weeks." Henry Miller looked up as Marcus entered the small kitchen, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile. Well, about time you showed up with flowers in your hand instead of that toolbox." Marcus felt sweat break out across his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Mr. Miller, I was hoping we could talk. About Catherine. About my intentions." "Sit down, son, before you fall down." Henry gestured to the chair across from him, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Coffee, please." Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended. He sat carefully, as if the chair might collapse under the weight of what he was about to ask. Henry poured coffee into a chipped blue mug and pushed it across the scarred wooden table. "You know, Marcus, I've been watching you these past months. Watching how you look at my daughter, how she looks at you. Watching how you learned her language instead of expecting her to struggle with yours." Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to do with his nervous energy. "Sir, I know this might seem sudden, but..." "Sudden?" Henry laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. "Son, I've been waiting for someone like you to show up in Catherine's life since she turned 16. Someone who sees her as a woman instead of a problem to be solved." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd expected resistance, arguments about Catherine's disability making her unsuitable for marriage, concerns about her ability to be a proper wife. He hadn't expected understanding. "The thing is," Henry continued, his voice growing serious, "Catherine's not like other girls. She's never going to be the kind of wife who can holler at you from the next room when supper's ready, or hear the baby crying in the middle of the night without you waking her up." Marcus leaned forward, his brown eyes intense. "Mr. Miller, I don't want Catherine to be like other girls. I want her to be exactly who she is." "And who is that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Marcus thought about all the evenings he'd spent in this house, watching Catherine work with needle and thread, seeing the concentration on her face as she created beauty from simple cloth. He thought about the way she laughed when he made clumsy mistakes with sign language, how she patiently corrected his hand positions until he got them right. He thought about the intelligence in her green eyes when she talked about her dreams for the dress shop, the fierce determination that burned beneath her quiet exterior. "She's the strongest person I've ever met," Marcus said finally. "She's creative and kind and braver than any soldier I fought beside during the war. She faces every day in a world that doesn't understand her, and she does it with grace and dignity. She's everything I never knew I was looking for." Henry studied Marcus's face for a long moment, as if reading something written there in a language only fathers could understand. Finally, he nodded. "Then you have my blessing to ask her." "But Marcus," Henry's voice carried a warning now, "if you ever make her feel less than the remarkable woman she is, if you ever treat her deafness like something that needs to be fixed or hidden, you'll answer to me. And despite what Dr. Hayes says about taking it easy, I can still swing a hammer hard enough to knock sense into a fool." Marcus stood up, relief and terror warring in his chest. "Thank you, sir. I promise you, I'll spend every day of my life making sure Catherine knows how precious she is." "Good. Now get out of my kitchen and go ask that girl to marry you before she dies of curiosity." She's been pacing the front room like a caged cat since you walked in here. Marcus found Catherine in the parlor, her hands busy with a piece of embroidery that she'd clearly been working on without paying attention. The thread was tangled and the stitches uneven, a sure sign that her mind was elsewhere. "Catherine," Marcus said softly, waiting until she looked up before continuing to speak and sign at the same time. "I just had a very interesting conversation with your father." Catherine set down her needlework, her hands trembling slightly. "Oh." Marcus dropped to one knee beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were small and soft but marked with the tiny scars that came from years of working with needles and scissors. To Marcus, they were the most beautiful hands in the world. "Catherine Miller," he said, his voice steady now that the moment had finally arrived. "I know I'm not much to look at and I don't have a lot of money saved up yet, but I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see beauty in everything around you. I love the way you make me want to be a better man. And I love the way you've taught me that the most important conversations happen with the heart, not the voice." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them. "Will you marry me?" Marcus asked, his hands shaping the words in the language she taught him. "Will you build a life with me here in Cedar Ridge? Will you let me love you for the rest of our days?" Catherine's answer came not in words or signs, but in the way she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the joy and love and hope that had been building in her heart for months. From the kitchen came the sound of Henry Miller chuckling and muttering something about young folks taking their sweet time about everything. And from across the street, Tommy Jenkins hooped loud enough to wake the dead, then ran off to spread the news that Marcus Kane and Catherine Miller were getting married. And wasn't that just the most romantic thing anyone had ever seen? The laughter started before Catherine even reached the church steps, rippling through the crowd like water over stones. October 15th, 1867, had dawned crisp and clear, perfect weather for a wedding, but Catherine felt like she was walking through a storm of whispered comments and barely concealed amusement. "Look at her dress," she heard Mrs. Hartwell say to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Thinks she's some kind of princess, doesn't she?" Catherine's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, but she kept her head high. The dress had taken her 3 weeks to make, working by candlelight after her daily chores were done. It was her mother's wedding gown, altered to fit her smaller frame and updated with delicate embroidery that had made her fingers ache from the intricate work. She thought it was beautiful, but seeing the smirks on some faces made her wonder if she'd been fooling herself. "You look perfect," Marcus murmured, his free hand moving in a quick sign that only she could see. "Don't listen to them." But it was hard not to listen when the comments followed them like shadows. Catherine had learned to read lips well enough to catch most of what people were saying, and very little of it was kind. Poor Marcus. Doesn't know what he's getting himself into. A deaf wife? How's she going to know when the baby's crying? Mark my words. He'll regret this before the year's out. Inside the half-finished church, Preacher Williams waited with his Bible open, his kind face creased with genuine happiness for the couple. The pews were packed with townspeople, some there out of friendship, others drawn by curiosity about the unusual wedding. Catherine recognized most of the faces, but she couldn't tell which ones were genuinely happy for her and which ones had come to see if she'd somehow mess up her own wedding ceremony. As they walked down the aisle, Catherine caught sight of her father in the front row, his face beaming with pride despite the lingering effects of his accident. Beside him sat Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Tommy Jenkins grinned at them from across the aisle, his hair slicked down with what looked like half a jar of pomade. But it was the faces in the back rows that made Catherine's stomach clench with anxiety. Jake Morrison and his cronies wore expressions of barely concealed amusement, as if they were watching a performance put on for their entertainment. Lucinda Hartwell sat ramrod straight, her mouth pursed in disapproval that seemed to encompass everything from Catherine's dress to the very idea of the wedding itself. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus Kane and Catherine Miller in holy matrimony." Catherine felt the familiar isolation that came with public gatherings where she couldn't participate fully. She could see the preacher's lips moving, catch some of his words, but the formal language of the ceremony was harder to follow than everyday conversation. Marcus had promised to help her understand, but she hated feeling dependent even on him during what should be the most important moment of her life. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, the preacher continued, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Someone in the back of the church snickered, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. She could imagine what they were thinking, that this ceremony was some kind of joke, that Marcus was making a terrible mistake out of pity or temporary infatuation. When it came time for the vows, Marcus turned to face Catherine fully, his brown eyes serious and loving. He spoke his promises aloud for the congregation, but his hands moved in the graceful language that belonged to just the two of them. "I, Marcus Kane, take you, Catherine Miller, to be my wife," he said, his fingers shaping each word with careful precision. "I promise to love you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and bad. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, and to be faithful to you for all the days of my life." Catherine felt tears threaten as she watched his hands form the words that meant more to her than any spoken vows could. When it was her turn, she spoke as clearly as she could, knowing that some people doubted whether she could even talk properly. "I, Catherine Miller, take you, Marcus Kane, to be my husband." Her voice was softer than most, shaped by years of not being able to hear herself speak, but it carried clearly through the quiet church. "I promise to love you and support you, to stand by your side through whatever comes, and to build a life with you that honors the love we share." But even as she spoke the words that bound her to Marcus forever, Catherine was aware of the whispers starting up again, the subtle sounds of people shifting in their seats and leaning toward each other to share comments. She couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but she could feel their judgment like a weight on her shoulders. When Preacher Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed her with gentle reverence, his hands framing her face as if she were made of spun glass. The kiss tasted like promises and hope, but it was quickly followed by the sound of applause that felt more polite than enthusiastic. As they turned to face their community as a married couple, Catherine saw the range of expressions in the congregation. Some faces showed genuine happiness. Mrs. Patterson was openly crying now, and Tommy Jenkins looked ready to burst with excitement. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly, and even Sarah Chun from the laundry offered a small, warm smile. But there were others whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly amused. Catherine heard someone say, "Give it 6 months," as they walked back down the aisle, and another voice responded with, "I'm betting 3. Outside the church, the October sun felt warm on Catherine's face, but she couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but instead she felt like she'd just provided entertainment for people who saw her marriage as either a curiosity or a tragedy. "Mrs. Kane," Marcus said softly, using her new name for the first time. "How does that sound?" Catherine managed to smile, pushing down the hurt that threatened to overwhelm her happiness. "It sounds like the beginning of everything." But as they accepted congratulations from well-wishers and endured the knowing looks from skeptics, Catherine couldn't help wondering if Marcus would eventually come to regret his choice. The whole town seemed convinced that he'd made a mistake, that marrying a deaf woman was an act of charity rather than love. What if they were right? What if the romance of their courtship couldn't survive the reality of daily life? What if Marcus woke up one morning and realized that love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between her world and his? As they walked toward the reception that Mrs. Patterson had insisted on hosting, Catherine held tight to Marcus's arm and tried to silence the doubts that the wedding guests had planted in her mind. She'd just married the man she loved more than life itself. So why did she feel like she was walking toward a battle instead of a celebration? The needle slipped through the silk like it was cutting through butter, but Catherine's hands moved with the speed and precision of someone who'd found her calling. 6 months had passed since her wedding, and the small room behind Marcus's carpentry shop had been transformed into something magical. Bolts of fabric in every color imaginable lined the walls, and 3 half-finished dresses hung from wooden forms that Marcus had carved by hand. "Mrs. Kane, this is absolutely breathtaking," gasped Margaret Henderson, the banker's daughter, as she turned in front of the mirror wearing her engagement dress. The deep blue silk brought out her eyes, and the fitted bodice showed off her figure without being improper. I've never owned anything so beautiful in my entire life. Catherine felt a familiar glow of satisfaction as she made final adjustments to the hem. Each dress was like solving a puzzle, figuring out what colors worked with a woman's skin, what style would flatter her figure, what details would make her feel like the best version of herself. It was work that filled her heart as much as her coin purse. The wedding is next month, Margaret continued, admiring herself from every angle. When word gets out about this dress, you're going to have more customers than you know what to do with. Catherine smiled as she pinned the hemline. Word was already getting out, faster than she'd dared to hope. Women were traveling from neighboring towns just to see what the deaf seamstress could create, and orders were backing up for weeks. Marcus had to expand the workshop twice already to keep up with her success. The bell above the door chimed, and Catherine looked up to see Martha Collins enter with her teenage daughter in tow. Martha's face was flushed with excitement, and she was practically bouncing on her toes. Catherine, oh, I'm so glad you're here. I have the most wonderful news. Martha's lips moved quickly, making her harder to read than usual, but Catherine caught the important parts. Something about the territorial governor's wife coming to Cedar Ridge. Something about a dress for a very special occasion. Slow down, Martha, Catherine signed with a laugh. What's this about the governor's wife? She's coming here, to Cedar Ridge, next month for the Harvest Festival. Martha's words tumbled over each other in her excitement. And she specifically asked about you. Someone told her about your work, and she wants to commission a gown for the territorial capital's Christmas ball. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The governor's wife, coming here, wanting her to make a dress for the most important social event in the territory. Are you certain? Catherine's hands moved carefully, not quite daring to believe what she was hearing. Absolutely certain. Mayor Caldwell got the letter yesterday. She'll be staying for 3 days, and she wants to meet with you personally to discuss the design. Martha was practically glowing with excitement. Catherine, do you realize what this means? If the governor's wife wears your dress to the Christmas ball, every important lady in Texas will want one of your creations. Margaret Henderson, still wearing her engagement dress, turned from the mirror with wide eyes. This is incredible, Catherine. You're going to be famous. But Catherine felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Fame meant attention, and attention meant scrutiny. It meant people looking for reasons to criticize, ways to tear down what she'd built. It meant pressure to be perfect when she still felt like she was learning as she went. What if I'm not good enough? Catherine asked, her hands moving hesitantly. What if I disappoint her? Not good enough? Martha looked at Catherine like she'd grown a second head. Honey, you made my sister's wedding dress so beautiful that 3 women cried just looking at it. You turned my plain brown church dress into something that made my husband remember why he married me. You're the most talented seamstress in 3 counties. Catherine wanted to believe Martha's confidence, but doubt gnawed at her like a persistent ache. She thought about Lucinda Hartwell, who'd been making snide comments about certain people getting too big for their britches whenever Catherine passed her shop. She thought about the whispers that still followed her through town sometimes, the people who seemed to be waiting for her to fail so they could say they'd known all along that Marcus had made a mistake. The workshop door opened again, and Marcus entered, his face bright with the satisfaction of a man who'd just finished a challenging project. He took in the scene, Margaret still in her engagement dress, Martha practically vibrating with excitement, and Catherine looking pale and worried. What's going on in here? He asked, his hands moving along with his words in the habit they'd both developed. The governor's wife wants Catherine to make her a dress, Margaret blurted out before anyone else could speak. For the Christmas ball in Austin. Can you believe it? Marcus's face transformed with pride and excitement. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and swept Catherine into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed despite her worries. Catherine, this is wonderful, he said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. I'm so proud of you. But what if I can't do it? Catherine asked, her fears tumbling out in a rush of movement. What if the dress isn't what she wants? What if I embarrass myself? Embarrass you? Embarrass the whole town? Marcus cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, his brown eyes serious and loving. Catherine Kane, you are the most talented woman I've ever known. You're going to create something so beautiful that the governor's wife will feel like a queen wearing it. But the pressure will make you do your best work, Marcus interrupted gently, just like it always does. Remember the first dress you made for Mrs. Patterson? You were terrified then too, and it turned out perfect. Catherine looked around her workshop, at the evidence of her success, at the women who believed in her abilities, at her husband whose faith in her never wavered. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe instead of worrying about what could go wrong, she should focus on what could go right. Besides, Marcus added with a grin that made him look like a mischievous boy, I have complete faith in my wife, and if anyone gives you any trouble about this commission, they'll have to answer to me. Margaret clapped her hands together excitedly. Oh, this is going to be so exciting. The whole territory will be talking about Catherine Kane's dress. That evening, as Catherine and Marcus sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Catherine found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in such a short time. A year ago, she'd been just Henry Miller's deaf daughter, pitted by some and ignored by most. Now she was Catherine Kane, respected businesswoman, with customers lining up for her services and the governor's wife wanting to wear her creation. Scared? Marcus asked softly, taking her hand in his. Terrified, Catherine admitted, but excited too. Is that strange? Not at all. The best things in life are usually a little scary at first. Marcus squeezed her hand. You know what I think? What? I think you're about to show the whole territory what I've known all along, that you're extraordinary. Catherine leaned against Marcus's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady certainty of his love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, new opportunities to succeed or fail. But tonight, sitting here with her husband in the golden light of evening, she felt ready to face whatever came next. After all, she'd already conquered the impossible by finding love in a world that had tried to convince her she was broken. How hard could it be to make one dress for one important woman? As it turned out, Catherine was about to discover that sometimes the biggest challenges come not from the work itself, but from the people who can't stand to see others succeed. The morning sun hadn't even touched the windowsills when Catherine found her workshop door standing wide open, hanging crooked on its hinges like a broken wing. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped inside, and what she saw made her stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well. Fabric lay scattered across the floor in colorful tatters, yards of silk and cotton and wool that had taken months to collect, now slashed beyond repair. Her sewing machine, the beautiful singer that Marcus had saved for 3 months to buy her, sat overturned with its delicate mechanisms bent and broken. But worst of all was the half-finished governor's dress, the creation she'd been pouring her heart into for 2 weeks, hanging in shreds from its wooden form. No, 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 Catherine whispered, dropping to her knees among the ruins of her dreams. She picked up pieces of the governor's dress with shaking hands, trying to see if any of it could be salvaged. But whoever had done this had been thorough in their destruction. On the back wall, painted in white letters that seemed to mock her, were the words, "Freaks don't belong." Catherine's scream pierced the morning quiet, a sound of pure anguish that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She'd made so few sounds in her life that this one felt torn from her very soul. Marcus came running from their house, still in his nightshirt, his hair standing up in all directions. When he saw the devastation, his face went through a series of changes. Confusion, understanding, and finally a rage so fierce that Catherine had never seen anything like it. Who did this? He demanded, his hands shaking as they formed the signs. Who would do something so cruel? Catherine couldn't answer. She sat surrounded by the pieces of her destroyed work, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what she'd lost hit her like repeated blows. Weeks of careful labor, hundreds of dollars worth of fabric, the commission that could have made her reputation. All of it gone. Other people began arriving, drawn by Catherine's scream and Marcus's shouts. Mrs. Patterson appeared first, her face going white when she saw the destruction. Tommy Jenkins was close behind, his young face twisted with anger. Dr. Hayes came running with his medical bag, thinking someone had been hurt, and stopped short when he saw what had really happened. "This is monstrous," Mrs. Patterson breathed, stepping carefully through the wreckage. Who could hate someone enough to do this? Marcus was examining the broken door, his carpenter's eye taking in the details of how the destruction had been carried out. 3 people at least, he said grimly. Maybe 4. They used a crowbar on the door, and these cuts in the fabric are too clean to be random. This was planned. Catherine heard him talking but couldn't focus on his words. All she could think about was the governor's wife, who would arrive in 4 days expecting a dress that no longer existed. All she could think about was the customers who had trusted her with their special occasions, whose faith in her had been destroyed along with their orders. "Catherine?" a familiar voice said gently, and she looked up to see Sarah Chun kneeling beside her, the Chinese woman's dark eyes full of sympathy. "I am so sorry this happened to you." "It's over," Catherine signed numbly. "Everything I worked for, everything I built, it's all ruined." "No," Marcus said fiercely, dropping to his knees beside her. "This isn't over. We'll rebuild. We'll start again. With what?" Catherine's hands moved sharply, anger and despair making her gestures choppy. "The governor's wife comes in 4 days. For days, Marcus. Even if I had fabric, even if I had a working sewing machine, I couldn't recreate weeks of work in 4 days. Then we'll explain what happened. She'll understand. Will she?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "Or will she think I'm just making excuses because I wasn't good enough to deliver what I promised? Either way, my reputation is destroyed." Marcus looked around at the devastation, his jaw working as he tried to find words that could fix this. But how do you repair destroyed dreams with promises? How do you rebuild trust when someone has deliberately tried to tear it down? "We'll find out who did this," Tommy said suddenly, his young voice fierce with determination. "And when we do, they'll pay for it." "That won't bring back my work," Catherine replied, but something in Tommy's certainty made her look up. "Maybe not," the boy admitted, "but it'll make sure they don't do it again." "And Catherine?" He waited until she was looking directly at him. "My ma's got a sewing machine that she never uses. It's old, but it works. And Mrs. Chen's got fabric from the dresses she was going to have you alter. It's not everything you lost, but it's something." Other voices began joining in, offering help that Catherine hadn't expected. Mrs. Patterson had fabric stored in her attic, remnants from her daughter's trousseau. Dr. Hayes's wife had a set of fine needles that she'd brought from back east. Even Margaret Henderson, still glowing from her engagement, offered to help with the simpler sewing tasks. "You see," Marcus said, his hands moving gently now. "You're not alone in this, Catherine. The whole town wants to help you succeed." "Not the whole town," Catherine replied bitterly, gesturing toward the painted message on her wall. Marcus's face darkened again. "No, not everyone. But the people who matter, the people whose opinions count. They're all here, ready to help you fight back." Catherine looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had watched her build her business from nothing, who had seen her talent and determination overcome every obstacle. For every person who had tried to tear her down, there were 3 others ready to lift her up. "The governor's dress," she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "If I worked day and night, if I had help with the cutting and pinning." "You'd need a miracle," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Then we'll make one," Marcus declared, his brown eyes blazing with determination. "Catherine Kane is going to deliver the most beautiful dress the governor's wife has ever seen, and the whole territory is going to know that destroying someone's dreams only makes them come back stronger." Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but something fiercer. Stubbornness, maybe. Rage at whoever had tried to break her. Determination not to let them win. "For days," she said, her hands moving with growing confidence. "We have 4 days to prove that some things can't be destroyed by jealousy and hate." For days, Marcus agreed, reaching out to take her hands in his. But we won't be working alone. As Catherine looked around at the destroyed workshop that represented months of dreams and labor, she felt something she hadn't expected, not just sadness and anger, but a fierce determination to prove that she was stronger than whoever had tried to break her. They thought they could destroy her by destroying her work. They were about to learn that they'd only made her more determined to succeed. The question was, could she really recreate weeks of intricate work in just 4 days? And even if she could, would the governor's wife still want a dress made by someone the town's troublemakers thought didn't belong? Catherine's fingers moved like lightning across the emerald silk, her needle finding its rhythm in the candlelit darkness of the third sleepless night. Around her, the workshop hummed with quiet activity. Mrs. Patterson cut pattern pieces by lamplight. Sarah Chun pressed seams with careful precision, and even Margaret Henderson sat in the corner, hand-stitching delicate beadwork despite her protests that she wasn't good with a needle. "How much more on the bodice?" Marcus asked softly, setting a cup of coffee beside Catherine's elbow. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, but he'd refused to leave her side since the reconstruction began. Catherine held up the intricate piece she'd been working on, examining it in the flickering light. The emerald silk seemed to glow like captured starlight, and the hand-sewn pearls caught every glimmer from the candles. It was beautiful work, perhaps the best she'd ever done. But was it enough? 6 more hours, maybe 7. She signed with one hand while continuing to sew with the other. If nothing goes wrong. But even as she said it, Catherine could feel the weight of the impossible task pressing down on her shoulders. The governor's wife would arrive tomorrow afternoon, expecting a gown that had taken Catherine 3 weeks to design and plan the first time. Now she was trying to recreate it from memory in just 4 days, working with borrowed materials and desperate hope. "It's magnificent," whispered Mrs. Patterson, holding up the skirt she'd been hemming. "I've never seen anything so elegant in all my years." Catherine paused in her stitching to look at what they'd accomplished. The dress was taking shape like a dream made real, flowing lines that would flatter any figure, details that spoke of hours of careful planning, colors that would make the wearer look like royalty. But would it be finished in time? More importantly, would it matter if it was? "Catherine," Sarah Chun said quietly, her accented English careful and precise. "I heard something today at the market that you should know." Catherine's needle stopped moving. Sarah's tone carried warning, and after 3 days of non-stop work, Catherine wasn't sure she could handle any more bad news. "What is it?" "Mrs. Hartwell has been talking, telling people that the governor's wife should be warned about your situation." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment at having to repeat such cruel words. "She says important people shouldn't be subjected to dealing with someone who is different." The needle slipped in Catherine's hand, pricking her finger and drawing a drop of blood that she quickly wiped away before it could stain the silk. She'd known this was coming, the whispers, the attempts to undermine her before the governor's wife even arrived. "Let her talk," Marcus said grimly, his hands forming angry shapes in the lamplight. "Actions speak louder than gossip. When the governor's wife sees this dress, she'll know exactly what kind of talent Catherine has." "But what if she doesn't even give me a chance?" Catherine asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind all evening. "What if she listens to the gossip and decides she doesn't want to work with someone like me?" Margaret Henderson looked up from her beadwork, her young face fierce with indignation. "Then she's a fool, and she doesn't deserve to wear something you made." "Margaret's right," Mrs. Patterson added firmly. "Any woman with eyes can see the quality of your work. And from what I've heard about the governor's wife, she's got more sense than to listen to small-town gossip." Catherine wanted to believe them, but doubt gnawed at her like a persistent ache. What if all this work, all this effort from people who believed in her, turned out to be for nothing? What if the governor's wife took one look at Catherine and decided she'd rather work with someone more conventional? "Besides," Tommy Jenkins said from the doorway, where he'd been keeping watch for any signs of more trouble, "I found out something interesting today." Everyone turned to look at the boy, who was practically bouncing with excitement despite the late hour. "What kind of something?" Marcus asked. The kind that involves 3 very nervous men who've been asking around town about when the next stagecoach leaves for San Antonio. Tommy grinned. Seems like someone's in a hurry to leave Cedar Ridge all of a sudden. Catherine felt a spark of satisfaction cut through her exhaustion. They're running. Like rabbits when the hunting dogs come out, Tommy confirmed. Jake Morrison's been asking about selling his store, and I heard Lucinda Hartwell's nephew rode out of town this morning with his saddlebags packed full. Good, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. Let them run. Cedar Ridge is better off without people who think destroying others' dreams is entertainment. Catherine returned to her stitching, but her mind was racing. If the people responsible for destroying her workshop were fleeing town, it meant they were afraid of getting caught. It meant they knew what they'd done was wrong, even if they tried to justify it as protecting the town's reputation. But more than that, it meant she was winning. They'd tried to break her spirit, and instead they'd only made her more determined. They tried to isolate her, and instead the whole community had rallied to her support. They tried to destroy her dreams, and she was rebuilding them stronger than before. Catherine, Sarah Chan said softly, may I ask you something? Catherine nodded, still focused on the intricate beadwork she was adding to the dress's neckline. When I first came to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago, people were not always kind to me either. Different accent, different customs, different way of seeing the world. Sarah's voice was thoughtful, remembering. I was afraid to start my laundry business because I thought no one would trust their clothes to someone foreign. Catherine looked up, seeing something in Sarah's dark eyes that she recognized. The weight of being different in a place that valued sameness. What changed your mind? Catherine asked. My husband said something that I never forgot. He said that being different is not the same as being wrong. He said that sometimes the world needs people who see things differently, who can offer something new. Sarah smiled, her hands steady on the fabric she was pressing. I think Cedar Ridge is lucky to have both of us. The words hit Catherine like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. She'd spent so much time worrying about fitting in, about proving she belonged, that she'd almost forgotten the simple truth Sarah had just reminded her of. She didn't need to be like everyone else to be valuable. Thank you, Catherine signed, her hands trembling slightly with emotion and exhaustion. No, thank you, Sarah replied, for showing me that building something beautiful is the best way to answer people who try to tear you down. As dawn light began creeping through the workshop windows, Catherine held up the nearly finished dress. It was everything she'd envisioned and more elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without being cold, beautiful in a way that would make any woman feel like the best version of herself. But more than that, it was proof. Proof that talent couldn't be destroyed by jealousy, that dreams were stronger than the people who tried to crush them, that sometimes being different was exactly what the world needed. One more day, Catherine whispered to herself, her fingers already reaching for the final details that would make this dress perfect. One more day to finish the most important work of her life. One more day to prove that Catherine Kane belonged exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was meant to do. One more day to show the world that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. The carriage wheels crunched to a stop in front of the Cedar Ridge Hotel, and Catherine felt her heart nearly jump out of her chest as an elegant woman in traveling clothes stepped down onto the dusty street. Governor's wife Rebecca Patterson, no relation to Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, was younger than Catherine had expected, with intelligent gray eyes and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of navigating political society. She's beautiful, Margaret Henderson whispered from their hiding spot behind the mercantile window. And look at that dress she's wearing. The fabric alone must have cost more than most people make in a month. Catherine swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of her own simple work dress and the calluses on her hands from 3 days of non-stop sewing. What had she been thinking? How could someone like her create something worthy of someone who clearly had access to the finest dressmakers in the country? Stop it, Marcus said firmly, his hand finding hers and squeezing tight. I can see that doubt creeping into your eyes, and I won't have it. You've created something extraordinary, Catherine. Don't let fear make you forget that. Through the window, they watched as Mayor Caldwell and his wife rushed forward to greet their distinguished visitor. Mrs. Patterson spoke with the easy grace of someone accustomed to meeting important people, but Catherine noticed that her eyes were taking in everything around her, the buildings, the people, the general atmosphere of the town. She's observant, Catherine signed, her hands moving nervously. She's judging everything she sees. Good, Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house Mrs. Patterson said stoutly. Let her judge. She'll see a town that's growing and prospering, full of good people who work hard and take care of each other. Catherine wanted to share Mrs. Patterson's confidence, but her stomach was tied in knots. The finished dress hung in her workshop, wrapped in clean white sheets like a precious secret. It was beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful thing she'd ever created. But would it be enough for someone who probably had gowns made by famous designers in New York and Paris? When is she supposed to come see you? Tommy asked, pressing his face against the window to get a better look at the governor's wife. This afternoon, after she's had time to rest from her journey, Catherine replied. Mayor Caldwell is bringing her by at 3 o'clock. That gave her exactly 4 hours to prepare. For hours to somehow transform herself from a nervous small-town seamstress into someone worthy of creating a dress for the most important woman in the territory. You know what you need? Margaret said suddenly, her face lighting up with inspiration. You need to look the part. Show her that you're not just talented, but professional. Before Catherine could protest, Margaret was dragging her toward the workshop, chattering excitedly about hairstyles and proper dress. Mrs. Patterson and Saracen followed, caught up in Margaret's enthusiasm, and soon Catherine found herself the center of a whirlwind of activity. Sit still, Margaret commanded, pulling pins from Catherine's simple braid and letting her auburn hair fall in waves around her shoulders. We're going to make you look like the successful businesswoman you are. Saracen appeared with Catherine's best dress, a deep blue creation that she'd made for her own wedding but had never worn since. Mrs. Patterson produced a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, and even Tommy contributed a handful of wildflowers that he'd picked from the field behind the church. As they worked, Catherine found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since Marcus first walked into Cedar Ridge. A year ago, she would never have imagined sitting in her own workshop, being fussed over by friends who believed in her talent, preparing to meet one of the most important women in Texas. There, Margaret said finally, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Now you look like someone who creates gowns for governors' wives. Catherine looked at herself in the small mirror Marcus had hung on the workshop wall. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized, confident, elegant, professional. Her hair was swept up in a style that Margaret had copied from a magazine. The blue dress emphasized her figure without being improper, and the cameo brooch added just the right touch of sophistication. But more than that, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just talent or determination, but a quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth. You're ready? Marcus said softly, his hands moving in the gentle signs that had become their private language. More than ready. At exactly 3 o'clock, the knock came at the workshop door. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as Marcus opened it to reveal Mayor Caldwell and the governor's wife, both looking curious and slightly uncertain about what they might find inside. Mrs. Patterson, may I present Catherine Kane, our local seamstress, Mayor Caldwell said formally. Catherine, this is Mrs. Rebecca Patterson, wife of our territorial governor. Catherine stepped forward, her mind blank for a moment as she faced the most important client of her life. Then training took over, and she offered a graceful curtsy that Margaret had made her practice. Mrs. Patterson, it's an honor to meet you, Catherine said, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves. I understand you're interested in commissioning a gown for the Christmas ball. The governor's wife studied Catherine with those intelligent gray eyes, taking in everything from her carefully arranged hair to her confident posture. I am indeed, though I must confess, I'm curious about your situation. I've heard conflicting reports about your abilities. Catherine felt the familiar flush of heat in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. I'm deaf, Mrs. Patterson. I have been since birth. But I can assure you that my hearing has no effect on my ability to create beautiful clothing. Interesting, Mrs. Patterson mused. And you can understand what I'm saying? I read lips quite well, and my husband translates when needed. But I find that most communication about design happens through showing rather than telling. Catherine gestured toward the draped form in the center of the workshop. Would you like to see what I've created for you? Mrs. Patterson nodded, and Catherine felt her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the white sheets. This was it, the moment that would determine not just whether she got this commission, but whether she could truly call herself a success. She pulled away the sheets with one smooth motion, revealing the emerald silk gown in all its glory. Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath was audible even to Catherine, who saw the woman's eyes widen with genuine amazement. My word, the governor's wife whispered, stepping closer to examine the intricate beadwork, the perfect lines, the way the silk seemed to shimmer with captured light. This is extraordinary. Catherine felt a smile spread across her face, not the nervous, hopeful expression she'd been wearing all day, but a confident smile that came from knowing she'd created something truly special. Would you like to try it on? Catherine asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded wordlessly, still staring at the dress as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. And as Catherine began the familiar ritual of helping a customer into one of her creations, she realized that she was no longer the nervous girl who'd been afraid of being judged. She was Catherine Kane, and she made dreams come true one stitch at a time.